All right, everyone. I think we have a packed house and we're ready to go. So let's get started. My name is Sam Fishman, and I'm the Sustainability and Resilience Policy Manager here with Spur. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Through research, education, and advocacy, Spur works to create an equitable, sustainable, and prosperous region in which all people thrive. I want to thank those of you joining us today who are Spur members. Your support enables us to advance our work to address crucial urban planning issues like coastal flooding and environmental justice. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join Spur to support our ongoing work and future programs like this one. So yeah, please consider becoming a Spur member. It's got all sorts of perks. You'll get to learn all about what we're up to here. And today, Spur is holding this panel to talk about the future of California climate policy in the gubernatorial election. We're committed here at Spur to a sustainable future for our region, and we're working to design regional and state policies that move the ball forward on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And these efforts include switching to sustainable modes of transportation, such as our public transit systems, which are in desperate need of saving this year. So we'll probably hear a bit about that today. But a better land use, we work on better land use practices and solving the housing crisis in California, which has a big tie-in with our efforts to create a sustainable region that is moving towards our climate goals. And we also work on decarbonizing our existing buildings, which is a critical but sometimes more hidden part of the climate puzzle. We also have a big focus on climate resiliency and disaster preparedness. We're working on adapting to sea level change, sea level rise, groundwater rise, wildfire resilience, and we also are working on earthquake preparedness for the region. We have a kind of focus on our sustainability and resilience team on the dilemma of existing buildings and how we can really retrofit our existing built environment for a net zero and climate resilient future. But today, we're talking about state climate policy, and California has sustained support for climate action across multiple administrations. It's enabled long-term policy development, including landmark laws like AB 32, which was passed in 2006, and which established California's first climate framework and scoping plan, and empowered the California Air Resources Board to design and implement policies to achieve these goals. We hit some of the goals for year 2020 early, and then passed another bill with even more ambitious climate targets. However, those targets we're falling short on. And so we need to accelerate and improve our climate policy statewide and think ambitiously again as we head into the gubernatorial elections. California's next governor will be responsible for putting the state back on track while balancing the need to tackle a cost of living crisis that includes high energy costs, high costs of transportation, and high costs for housing. At Spur, we recently hosted a number of gubernatorial candidates, including Katie Porter and Antonio Villaraigosa, Tony Thurmond, and Tom Steyer. And we'll be hosting Matt and Han here on the 27th. We also hosted the candidates for state insurance commissioner, another key state leadership position in this discussion. And I think it's important to say that a more insurable built environment overlaps with a built environment that is sustainable and resilient to accelerating climate-driven weather and wildfire events. The gubernatorial discussions touched on the role of housing and transit in reducing climate emissions. They also touched on the role of our state agencies like CARB, the CEC, and CPUC, and our regional air districts in regulating the emissions from our buildings, industries, and vehicles. At what point do we draw the line on polluting equipment and industries? We also discussed, and our CEO, Sean, has discussed with the gubernatorial candidates the challenge of what kind of equipment we might have to draw the line on. Where do we start phasing out certain industries, certain equipment? Where do we do we ask polluters to pay in this state? I won't get into the specific statements or discussions with the gubernatorial candidates, but I'll just note that there is a significant variation on how each candidate addresses these challenges. I found it particularly interesting to hear responses related to new rules being proposed in the Bay Area, or being proposed and in the Bay Area passed, regulating nitrogen oxide emitting heating equipment, among other policy discussions. So we're going to get into it today with our panel and ask about the future of our state's leadership. And I want to thank our event co-organizer and moderator, Louise Bedsworth, Executive Director at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley Law. And Louise brought this idea to us for this event, and it fit in perfectly with our gubernatorial series here at Spur. And so this is hopefully will set the stage for fresh and revitalized discussion about state climate policy. And I'll pass it over to you, Louise. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everyone at Spur for hosting us here today. It's a really wonderful space, and thank you to all of you for braving the late breaking rain to be with us. So yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about climate and energy in the upcoming gubernatorial election. And I think Sam already covered a lot of why this matters, but this is a topic that CLE took on for this year because we just thought it was incredibly important that we are able to educate the candidates, all candidates regardless of party, on the key issues around energy and environment and climate, and that we raise these issues up also for voters to be looking out for them and understanding how they play out in the election. What role does the governor play in maintaining our leadership and seeing success and tackling some of the new problems that we're facing? And without a doubt, California is a climate and environmental leader and has been for decades. But we are definitely seeing the challenges as we've continued down this pathway where we're facing increasing challenges with affordability, livability, inequality. And so as we really think about this next phase of California's energy transition, it really gets to thinking about the systems nature of climate and how we are going to address this problem while also ensuring we're bringing along all communities, that we are doing this transition in a way that doesn't look like the transition we did decades ago, but really looks like one that lifts California up into the next phase of its economic growth. And so we're also doing this, of course, in the face of a lot of federal hostility and attacks on California and, in fact, subnational city and state authority across the nation. So without overstating it, I think we are at a really critical moment as we think about the future of climate and energy policy here in California, but more broadly. So I'm thrilled that 4 really, really smart and qualified people have agreed to come today and talk about this topic with us. And I'll just run quickly down the line. We have Kate Gordon, the CEO of California Forward. Then we have Mary Kreisman, the CEO of California Environmental Voters. And then Max Vargas, the president and CEO of Green Mining Institute, and Sarah Karlinski, the director of research and policy at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. And so what we're going to do today is just sort of run through a set of questions. We'll have each panelist start with to answer a short question. We'll then pop around on a few different topics. Want to be sure to leave time for questions from the audience, so I will do my best to keep us to time so that we are able to hear from all of you as well. But just even when we did the prep call for this, lots of things to talk about. So we will do our best to be concise, and I will do my best to keep everybody concise.
There's like 3 seats in front, if people front row that are empty, if anybody wants to come and sit down from the back.
Raise your hand if you have an empty seat next to you. Okay, there are your 3 seats. Okay, great. All right, well, so we're going to start off, and we'll just probably go down the line. Maybe we'll start with Kate. If you can each, in just a couple, like 2 minutes, share what you see as critical climate and environmental issues in the upcoming gubernatorial election.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I won't take very long. But first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks so much to Spur. Huge fan of Spur for many years, and Really happy to be in this beautiful space, which I always love being in. I think, and we'll talk a lot more about this, but the gubernatorial election, I'll underscore what Louise already said, which is super, super important. And it's super important not only because it's always important, but because we're at such an inflection point in California right now. We're at such a moment of like, all of these things are happening simultaneously. If we want to continue leadership on climate, we do need to go to the sort of next level of how do we show that we can build an economy that is reducing inequality, providing economic mobility and opportunity, working across every region of the state for Californians in all kinds of situations, that is continuing to reduce emissions and provide climate resilience. Like that is a very big agenda, but fundamentally, if what we're trying to do with climate action is a combination of energy transition and climate resilience, we have to show that we can do both those things in a way that really works for people. And I think that all of a sudden we're having this sort of confluence of things happening around California just became the most inequitable state in the country. We just passed Louisiana for that. So that's really shocking and really challenging. We're the fourth largest economy. We have massive inequality. We have 30% of people are living paycheck to paycheck in the state. We are having a huge affordability conversation, partly because of that, but also partly because things are getting more expensive while people's ability to pay for them is not getting better in a lot of parts of the state. And then we have all kinds of really interesting dynamics around like really rapidly intensifying energy demand, which we haven't seen in years. All of a sudden happening, many of the companies in this state are driving that. So I just think it's really interesting. We've kind of gone from a place where we were like, we are the innovators of the technology that will solve the climate crisis, and we are the regulators and the leaders on regulation, and that's all true. But now we're at the we need to start facing the trade-offs. We need to start thinking about the tools in the toolbox that go beyond regulation, that go beyond these sort of technocratic approaches. And that is hard. And I say all that, Louise, to say the governor is the person in the position to do a lot of that. The governor is able to be cross-agency and integrated and have an approach that brings in a lot of those pieces and aligns them. That is not an easy thing to do. But it really is the governor's role to do that because the legislature is doing really innovative things, but someone has to implement them. The agencies are doing really interesting things, often at total cross purposes to each other. Who is bringing it all together with a vision and then an implementation strategy? Fundamentally, that's the governor, but that takes leadership, really good people, and the ability to actually be pretty honest about the fact that this is all going to require a lot of trade-offs and a lot of pretty honest conversation. And I think that's what we need. That is a lot to ask, but that's the place we're in.
Yeah. So I appreciate Louise saying don't want to overstate this. I actually don't think there's a way to overstate how important who California's next governor is. To paint a picture, we are causing geopolitical crisis for oil across the world right now. We are rolling back climate policy, progress, climate justice solutions, left and right, federally and in the state. Delivering huge bailouts and giveaways to big oil. Big oil, our opposition, is as emboldened as ever. Their narrative about affordability is that we can't afford climate progress or action because it's too expensive. Instead of saying climate change isn't real, now they're saying we can't afford climate action because of the crisis they created. Their climate crisis is driving an affordability crisis. It's jacking up energy rates, insurance rates, gas prices, grocery bills, water bills, and they're pushing propaganda that leverages the affordability crisis that they created to roll back our policies. So when we think about what's happening federally, when we think about what's happening internationally, and rollbacks aren't just happening here, they're happening globally. And we think about the governor of California as the fourth largest economy in the world, and arguably one of the best places on earth to prove that we can solve the climate crisis and define how we do it with equity and justice at the center. Arguably the most important counterweight to a hostile federal government? I don't think we can overstate how important this is. This is our best last chance at climate action before 2030. When you talk about what needs to happen, changing who's in office changes what's possible. Full stop. Right now, we don't have the power. We aren't winning. If we change who's in office, we change that. Having a climate justice governor who prioritizes, has a vision, willing to do the hard stuff that Kate just talked about, that is what it's going to take. Electing a climate justice governor in California is our last best chance at climate action before 2030. But here's the good news. The good news is we have some phenomenal candidates running. That isn't always the case. Sometimes you need a leader, and those are not the folks who are running and the folks who are kind of up at the topic as contenders. I'm going to talk about here who they are. When you go on our website, you can see who they are. But I would just say we have a chance to elect folks who are tried and true on these issues, ready to do the hard things, and have proven that they're ready to take on the powerful interests it takes to move this forward. Unfortunately, we've kicked the can down the road so long now that we don't just get to say, this is the one top priority for our next governor. They have to do it all. They have to finance the transition to clean energy and resilience. And we have to use all. We have to use regulation, incentives, corporate polluter funding, get them to pay up. We have to invest in resiliency. We have to save our water. There is so much that they have to do. Electrify our buildings, our transportation, scale up clean energy. So much they have to do. Make all of this affordable. So we don't get to just say there's one thing. Unfortunately, they have a big task because we've kicked the can down the road. But I would say this position is our last best chance at climate leadership.
Well put. No, I love the energy behind this because I think the timing of this has been seen, with everything that's happened federally, obviously, we are now in a position where we have to double down on what we can do in California and continue to lead. California has been leading. I think the threats we face from, for example, the polluters and the industry players is one moving challenge. Insofar as we've done this, though, honestly, a big part of that hurdle has been how we've structured the work and whether or not this leadership that we've led on is going to be durable, right? It's facing now a challenge of this fragility and as it pertains to who's benefiting from the work that we're doing, right? What is a transition without its people, right? What is a leader without its people? And so this is the opportunity we have before us now, is whether or not the transition is going to include the folks who are bearing the costs, if they're also going to be benefiting from all those impacts. And I think that's where we hit the mark right. We can actually capitalize effectively on not just this cycle, but on the work that's to come. We have to be able to deliver that kind of climate progress that people can actually feel, right? People can actually see. That's what will make them believe too. And that's the reality is we also get stuck on GDP. We talk about the fourth largest economy, right? GHGs. We're great with a lot of the acronyms, but what has that meant for a lot of our communities that are most hardest hit? We're seeing this growing divide, and whether or not this is actually resonating. Hence, I think the larger spotlight we're seeing around the topic of affordability and whether or not there'll be a transition. I know for us, as I'm thinking about this work, I'm seeing the history of redlining, right, where communities were written out quite literally on maps. That's just been perpetuated now, to another level with the climate inequities we're seeing. That redlining from way back in the day, right, from decades ago now, really sparked and accelerated environmental injustices, disinvestment, lack of wealth. Those same communities are now bearing that brunt or seeing that acceleration. And the response can't just be, all right, now let's just mitigate that, right? That's not going to be enough. The response needs to be, as I put it, needs to be greenlining, needs to be actually proactive investment into the communities that are hardest hit and to the folks that are bearing the brunt of it. That's where I think we'll see the work that needs to move forward really take hold, especially as we're talking about affordability and the crises we're seeing across from energy and to insurance. I know we'll touch on some of these other topics as we discuss this, but we're seeing some of these issues just accelerate. Case in point, the insurance crisis and wildfire risks as an example. But the investments and the work to mitigate those risks haven't really been commensurate with that growing risk, right? Haven't really accounted for it. This is not a separate item. These are climate-linked system failures that we can look to address in this next push forward. And I think that's what we're looking for in the next governor too, right? In that leadership where they're looking at, well, these are costs that have been socialized to a lot of households, but with uneven benefits when we roll out programming, when we roll out initiatives. So that plan around execution, I think, is really important. You have to be able to execute, you have to be able to align, and you have to treat it, I think, as a core design principle of the work, right? The climate equity work, the affordability components of it, has to deliver equitable outcomes, and there has to be some willingness to shake the market around how that's done so it actually does benefit communities. So I think that, especially in light of, as I said, in light of the federal government's, I guess, retreat, to put it mildly, if not, a growing opposition to the work, not to mention the industries and the sectors we're facing, that's the opportunity before us now.
Well, this is an amazing panel. I was really interested to hear what everyone had to say. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection. It might seem maybe a little wonky after everything that has been discussed, but the connection between housing, transportation, and climate. I think everyone in this room and anyone who is a SPUR member knows that housing can be a climate solution, and thinking about where housing goes is absolutely essential to help drive down our greenhouse gas emissions and our climate emissions. And yet the state is sort of, despite being this incredibly large state, the most populous state, the fourth largest economy, all the accolades that we've just been describing, the state really doesn't have a system or a mechanism to develop a rationalized plan for the state of California as to where we're going to grow, where we don't grow, how we go about integrating everything that we know about resilience and risk with our growing demand for housing. We don't yet have a mechanism to ensure that housing is built in kind of the most sturdy and sustainable locations, particularly in areas along the coast, which benefit from what some people call natural air conditioning in the form of fog and other things. It's really, really important that we figure out how to place housing intensively in the areas that can most sustain it. And we while we have some tools, those tools heretofore have been ineffective.